So there's this scene in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. It's the third movie, and Indiana, the main character, he has to go through these trials to find the Holy Grail. And in one of these trials, he has to make this leap of faith. Okay, and he's trying to get across this giant gap, this giant just empty space in this cave. And he's standing there, and there's this huge gap ahead of him. Below him is just this giant pit of darkness. Okay? And he's standing there, and he has to put all his fears aside and just trust that when he takes a step, he'll be safe. And so you see him there, and he's contemplating it, and all you see below him is just this pit of darkness. And he takes that step. And then there's that moment where it looks like he's going to fall, and then he catches himself. And he realizes that there's this illusion that made it look like below him was darkness, but really he's standing on this walkway, and he's able to walk across. And he put his fears aside, and he just trusted. He trusted in these trials. Now, unlike Indiana Jones, we find this guy in Isaiah in chapter 7 named Ahaz, and he was the king of Judah, okay? And he had this opportunity, this moment, to put his trust in God, but he decided not to. See, what happened was that Israel and that Syria, these two nations were ganging up against him, okay? Because they wanted to take on Assyria. And see, Ahaz didn't want to. He was afraid. It says that he was shaken like the wind, like the trees in the wind. He was scared. And so what happens is that Isaiah, this prophet, goes to talk to him, and he assures him what God says, and God says, everything's going to be okay, just put your trust in me. But what Ahaz does is that he decides not to. And God says, Ahaz, ask for a sign. And Ahaz doesn't even do this. He says, I will not ask for a sign, I will not put the Lord to the test. But he didn't do that out of reverence. He did that because he was afraid, and he didn't want to ask God for a sign, because he didn't actually trust him. And so because of this, because of his lack of trust, Ahaz put Judah in jeopardy with God. And so I want to go on this journey, this interpretive journey, and I want to study this chapter in Isaiah. And I want to be able to put aside all our modern thoughts and all our modern feelings about the passage and get into the actual text, into their town, and what the people at this time would have thought and what they would have read into it. So I want to go on this journey, and I want you to come with me. It's really easy to just read the Bible and just make your own conclusions about the context, but to truly and honestly understand everything that's going on and what Ahaz felt in this chapter, we have to first understand the historical context. So with Isaiah 7, we have to begin with the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah, as it says at the beginning, was written by the prophet Isaiah. And the prophet Isaiah ministered from about 743 BC to 700 BC. And he reigned with 4 kings. Okay, so he had 4 kings that he worked with. Now, there were 2 that came before Ahaz, who we see in chapter 7. And the first one was King Uzziah. And King Uzziah had a good, long reign for about 50 plus years working with God. And he conquered the Philistines, and everything was good. But then towards the end, he got arrogant. Because of this arrogance, he got leprosy. Then we see King Jotham. And Jotham tried his best to lead Judah to follow God. But ultimately, the people didn't want to follow him. So then we get to Ahaz. And so we had 2 kings beforehand who did an okay job. And now it's time to see how Ahaz does. But we find that Ahaz becomes this idolatrous king. And he leads his people astray. So why this conflict with Assyria? Well, you see that during this time, Assyria became so powerful that it began to expand and just conquer all the surrounding kingdoms. And so, because of this, it's common to see revolts and uprisings in various kingdoms that are being conquered. And so we see Syria and we see Israel, and they want to stand against Assyria. And so they want to see if Judah, Ahaz, who rules Judah, they want to see if Ahaz will help. But Ahaz, who's afraid, this idolatrous king who's afraid, doesn't want to help them. And so because he doesn't want to help them, Israel and Syria gang up against him. And that's where we see him in chapter 7. We see him cornered and ganged up upon. And so, since we know this history, since we can understand what happened back then, we understand the politics, we can now understand how Ahaz felt and how he felt cornered, and that he felt that his decisions to not stand against Assyria, backfired on him. Now that we've been in their town, so to say, where do we go next? How do we move from understanding the passage from the people of that day, how they understood it? How do we go from that to understanding now? It seems to be this huge gap between how they lived and how we lived, and what we understand and what they understand. How do we connect those two worlds, the ancient world and the world we live in today? How do we move that understanding from their town, from understanding the history, to putting it today? Well, we need to make a bridge. We need to connect our two worlds and make a bridge. So, now that we have the history behind us and we're on our way trying to cross these two different worlds, the ancient world and now we're in the modern world, and we're trying to figure out the similarities and differences between the both. And so to understand the text and to make it to where we can understand it from a modern world view, we have to figure out what's similar and what's different. And so when you look at Isaiah 7, you find at the beginning, you see Ahaz, and he's scared because of Syria and Israel about to take him captive. And you see Isaiah the prophet come to him and give him words of encouragement. Well, today, we wouldn't see anything like that. How many times do you see a political power in the world trying to go into war, and then you see a minister or some religious person go and give them counsel? No military person today is going to take counsel from any religious leader or minister. We wouldn't see that today. Another difference is in just the language we use. So later on in the chapter, when you see Ahaz refuse the sign, God gives Ahaz a sign anyway. And the sign's about a virgin that will give birth. Well, in our language, we see virgin, right? And we think of it in a sexual nature. But this word, this Hebrew word, Alma, you see, it actually is probably better translated as young woman. And that when you look at the usage of Alma in the Old Testament, you see that it's more commonly used in reference to a young woman or a young maiden. And so the translated as virgin is to give it a whole different meaning in general. And that the difference today is that we see virgin and we take it a whole different way, but to them, Alma meant young woman. So the verse, the chapter, this sign is more like a young woman who's about to give birth. And that knowing that, we see in chapter 8, we see that Isaiah's wife has a second son. And maybe this second son is the promised child that God gives a sign to. And when it comes to similarities about this topic, I mean, it's really easy to spot out, because how many times have we been in a situation where we felt like we were cornered and we had no options and we were just scared and we didn't know who to turn to, and instead of trusting God, we try to do it our own way and get out of it our own way. And you see that with Ahaz in chapter 7. Another similarity is today that we see war all the time, and we see certain nations gang up on other nations and make treaties, make alliances, and it's no different than the ancient world. War back then, there's just different means of killing and different means of fighting. You know, the weapons have enhanced, but really the motivations haven't really changed. You know, we see war and we see alliances today like we did in chapter 7. So, now we're here in our town, and we've made it through this journey. And you might be asking yourself, what do we do with it now? Like, is there any way that we can find an application for it? Is there any way we can take this chunk in Isaiah 7 and find something for us? Yes. You see, by going through this journey and by working through the steps, we've actually rid ourselves from making false assumptions from our Western worldview. And because we went through the history, went through the context, and compared and contrasted, because we did those things, we've now opened it up to where we can get a clear view of what the text says. So when we look at this story, we don't find some obscure story in the Old Testament about these nations going to war with each other. No, what we find is a story about trust and trust in God. You see, when we try and bring it to our town and find an application for ourselves, we don't ask ourselves, what happened when Ahaz didn't trust God? But now we ask ourselves, what happens when we don't trust God? And we find, just like Ahaz, you see, when Isaiah was counseling Ahaz, Isaiah told him that Syria and Israel were like two smoking firebrands, and that they were just going to blow out. They're just going to be gone someday. That they were nothing in comparison to God, who was going to be there forever, who was all-powerful. But instead of taking these words as comfort, Ahaz was still scared, and he didn't trust God's power, and he didn't trust God's might, and that he was more afraid of these nations' power than God's power. And so when it came time to put his trust into something, he chose not to put his trust into God. So when we don't trust God, we find what happens is, it might just be what happened to Ahaz. Is that when Ahaz didn't trust God, he loses God's protection. And that God brings judgment upon Judah. And so, instead of being in comfort with God and being under his protection, we might, when we don't trust him, lose his protection and choose to go the opposite way of where God wanted us to go. So this brings another question. How do we keep our trust in God? How can we continue to do this? And one way to do this is to get a small group of people and get some friends who are fellow Christians, and that they can encourage you and you can encourage them, and that when you're in a place of darkness or you feel like you're surrounded and you're cornered like Ahaz, you can go to them and they can be your Isaiah and they can give you comfort, and maybe they can speak God's truth to you. And so by doing this, you're always in God's trust, and you're always being able to trust God, and you're under his protection. And so maybe you found yourself in a place where you lost a loved one, or a loved one sick, or you lost your job, or it just seems like life is against you and everyone's against you. Or maybe you're standing in front of a door and you're afraid of what lies beyond that door. Or maybe you're standing in front of this pit of darkness like Indiana Jones, and you're afraid to take that step because you're afraid of what might happen. You're afraid of falling. But I encourage you to, instead of being afraid and running away, I encourage you to take that step and to find that there's something there the whole time, something holding you. And it was God. Or I encourage you to go through that door and to find God's love on the other side.